In today's show, we answer two listeners' questions. Trent, who's concerned, and by the way, rightly so, what would happen to our property markets if Labor Party's policy of cutting back negative gearing benefits and capital gains tax benefits comes in? Well, I'll tell you right now, it's going to be devastating. And we also answered Joanne's question about, does she need a will? Ken Race will give her all the reasons why and what to watch out for. By the way, even if you don't want to think about your future, you better think about a will. He'll explain why. And I'm going to, in my mindset moment, tell you 20 things people who die regret. And it may not be the things you're thinking about. So welcome to this week's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's most trusted property commentator, who has once again been voted our leading expert in wealth creation. That's the 5th time he's won a similar award in the last 7 years.
I've turned today's show over to you. We're going to answer two questions. One from Trent about the impacts of Labor's proposed negative gearing and capital gains tax changes. And boy, are they significant. So if you've got any interest in property, you better listen to the findings of the RiskWise report that suggests the impact could be quite devastating. And we're also going to answer Joanne's question about whether you need a will or not. And no matter what age you are, I'm sure you're going to get some benefit from Ken Race, who's going to give Joanne some great advice. And in my mindset moment, actually it's a bit related to Joanne's question, I'm going to talk about 20 regrets that people have when they die. And there could be some interesting surprises there, and maybe some lessons for both you and me, so we can do some stuff so we don't have those regrets when the inevitable happens. So, welcome to this week's show, and let's get on with it. A short while ago, I had a question sent to me on Facebook by one of our clients, Trent, who said, Michael, my current concern with the property market, and this isn't a political statement, said Trent, is the proposed scrapping of negative gearing by the Federal Labor Party. What impact do you think this is going to have on our property markets? Well, I said to Trent, it's going to have a major impact, and I'm quite concerned about it. And I'm going to give you my answer to Trent, and then I'm going to give you the backstory of why I think that's going to happen. But my answer to Trent was, hey, that's a great question, but my strategy is not going to change because negative gearing is not a property investment strategy. It's a short-term financial position, depending upon how you finance your property, how much equity you have, how much interest you pay, and how much your other outgoings are. So, Trent, my strategy and yours should be to build as big an asset base as you can so that in the future you're going to have choices. Now, how you're going to finance your retirement is really going to depend a lot upon the lending and tax situations of the day in the future. But in the meantime, the bigger asset base you have, the more choices you're going to have. And by the way, there's going to be a myriad of changes to the tax and superannuation laws between now and when you retire. So don't change your long-term strategy because of short-term ups and downs. And that's what my recommendation is to you as well. Now, I am concerned that with a federal election looming and the possibility of Labor Party becoming our new government, they are going to create a concern for our property markets. And a report recently showed that house prices could slide by 9% in Sydney and Melbourne if the Labor Party gets into power and introduces its planned property tax changes. Now, earlier this year at our annual Wealth Retreat conference, over the weekend we had a guest speaker, Doron Pellick, who is the CEO of RiskWise Property Research, and the co-author of a report together with Doron, Pete Wargent. Both of these gentlemen are regular contributors to Property Update, so you can read the regular blogs there, but they produced a report to assess the impact of the ALP's proposed limits to, the limits was to limit negative gearing to new rental dwellings and to halve the capital gains tax discounts from currently 50%, so that you're now only going to get a 25% reduction of the tax that you'd pay. Now, the suggestion was, in this report that RiskWise put together, It was like increasing interest rates by 1.5%, and these changes, if brought in today's market, which was very different to the markets when they initially proposed them, it would drop property values by 9 and 10% around Australia. I'm going to go into a bit more detail in a moment. But with the federal election looming, it's important to understand this, and policymakers, lenders, fund managers and property developers better get their head around it, and us as property investors must as well, because it will affect us. See, these proposals were first put before the previous election. That's almost 3 years ago. But the landscape in the Australian property markets changed considerably since then, and the proposal should be reassessed. Remember, we were having a booming time in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, and the market has moved. We know that credit restrictions and tighter lending standards have had a direct impact on how much money investors can get, and the housing market has slowed down, and the booms of Melbourne and Sydney are long gone now. However, earlier this year, Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen shrugged off suggestions that the proposed tax amendments should now be scrapped because of falling house prices and the fact that houses are more affordable. In fact, he said that negative gearing and capital gains tax changes are about making long-term structural adjustments rather than addressing short-term policies. Now, the reason they are put to us as why they were proposing these changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax was to improve housing affordability, to stop first home buyers competing with investors, and to strengthen the Commonwealth budget position by giving away less money to ugly, greedy investors. Well, they were my words, the ugly, greedy investors part. And the economic and property landscape has changed since they've come in. And so I think the modelling has to change as well, and the Labor Party better recognise that if they bring in these changes, property prices are going to drop considerably, and according to the report, it would be like increasing interest rates by 1.5%, and you can imagine what that would do to you and me and our property markets. So the suggestion was that in Melbourne and Sydney, property values could drop up to 8.5% or so. In Queensland, it would probably be a little bit less than that, more like 7%. In Western Australia, the apartment market would drop close to 10%, maybe the housing market only 7%. South Australia wouldn't be as hard hit because not as many investors there, but still property values would drop 6%. Tasmanian property values would drop only 2-3%. Canberra house prices would drop 6%, and the Northern Territory would suffer terribly with house price drops because of the changes affecting investors buying properties in the short term. Now, I think there's even more onflow from the proposed Labor change to taxes, because if they push investors to buy new properties rather than established properties, they're going to push them into buying new apartments, which are not good investments, or house and land packages in the outer suburbs, new properties as well, which in general don't make good investments. But interestingly, that's where first home buyers buy. So when on the one hand they say we're bringing in these policies to protect first home buyers from investors, no, they're not. Having said that, once you own the property, it's actually going to be a used property that investors aren't going to get the tax benefits from. What all this means is that suddenly your property is going to devalue. It's a bit like buying that new car and driving it out of the showroom. So the bottom line is, and this isn't meant to be a political commentary, but the report was an independent assessment which explained that the proposed ALP tax reforms could achieve some of their stated objectives, but not others. And there would be a significant economic flow-on effect due to falling consumer confidence as they see the value of property values of their homes and homes around them plummeting. And as I said, it's going to push investors to buying the wrong sort of properties. So that was the backdrop to my answer to Trent, that yes, there are real big concerns. Having said that, in the long term, property is going to be a great investment, and these short-term ups and downs shouldn't change your strategy. It will affect confidence, but interestingly, negative gearing is likely to be grandfathered, or the Labor Party says it will be grandfathered. So if you buy a property before the election, you will keep getting the negative gearing benefits. But again, don't change your long-term strategy for short-term ups and downs in the market. But we're going to have some interesting times ahead, and I bet you we're going to discuss this topic a few more times between now and the election that's coming up sometime next year. We're coming up to a short break, but stick around because after the break in my mindset message, I'm going to explain to you the common regrets people have when they die. Fascinating stuff, and maybe we'll learn some lessons from it. And then Ken Race answers Joanne's question about does she need a will. Now, Joanne's only in her 40s, but I guess the question to you is, do you need a will? Do you understand what's involved? Do you understand the documentation that's involved? And there are some special tips that Ken gives that I think you're going to find very useful. So I'll see you back in just a moment.
If you're unsure what to do next in our changing property markets, why not turn to the proven and trusted team at Metropole Property Strategists to take advantage of their expertise of profitably investing through the last 5 property cycles. The team at Metropole have been involved in over $3 billion worth of property transactions, creating wealth for their clients, and they can do the same for you. They don't sell property, so their advice is independent and unbiased. Metropole can devise a strategy, their buyer's agents will buy your property for you, or you could use their renovations team, property development, or portfolio management services. Arrange a time for an obligation-free chat at metropole.com.au. Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
I like including my mindset moment in each show to help you upgrade your wealth operating system. Remember, you can't drive a Ferrari with the engine of a Hyundai. So what we need to do is change the way you think, change the way you feel about money, success, and give you more rich habits and lower some of your poor habits. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about dying. Now, that's pretty morbid, but unfortunately, one of my friends from my childhood died recently. He was the same age as me. Pretty scary stuff, and a short, sudden illness. So what do people regret when they die? Now, doing a quick Google search showed me the following. So I'd like to share with you 20 of the biggest regrets people have when they die, because maybe it's not too late for you to change the way you do some things so you enjoy it more and don't have those regrets. Now, interestingly, the number one regret was caring too much about what other people think. It's only when you realise how little other people are really thinking about you, in a negative sense, that you realise how much time you spend caring and wasting about others about this is such a waste of time. Another regret people had was not accomplishing enough. I guess the lesson is start taking action. Another big regret people had was not truly telling somebody how they felt. Hey, what can you learn from that one? Not standing up for themselves more was another regret. Look, sometimes it's too easy to think that if you go all out to please everybody, you'll be liked by more people, or your partner won't run off with somebody else. Age probably teaches us to be nice, but not at the expense of your own happiness. The fifth regret is not following their passion. What secret passion have you got that you want to follow, or are you just following somebody else's passion, your boss's passion? Sixth regret a lot of people had was arguing with their loved ones all the time. Life's short, and you never really know when that last time you're going to speak with somebody you love is going to be. The seventh regret is not allowing your children to grow up the way they want it to be. I remember when my kids grew up, they asked me what they should become, and I said to them, choose something you're going to have fun doing. Choose something you're going to be passionate about. So allow your kids to grow up to be who they want to be. The eighth regret was not living more in the moment enough. Watching our children grow up and make mistakes, realise how short-lived and how precious time really is. So as we age, many of us live less and less in the present. Working too much was a big regret. Yeah, they say you can't take all the toys with you. Travelling too little was another regret. And listening to everybody else was. So make your own decisions and feel confident in the decisions you're making. Going against your gut only breeds resentment and bitterness. As we're running through the 20 most common regrets of those people who die, another one was not taking good care of themselves. And another one was not willing to take risks. Now, everyone's got their own idea of what risky is, but you know when you're living too much in your comfort zone. In hindsight, some people just feel they've missed out on a lot of adventures in life. What could you do differently? What calculated risk could you take? Okay, as we run through those 20 regrets, people said they didn't have enough time. It said that time speeds up as you age, and I think that's true. Worrying too much was a regret, not appreciating enough was a regret, spending little time with family was. That's important, isn't it? Taking yourself too seriously was a regret. Not doing enough for others was a big regret too. And feeling sad all the time was the 20th regret. The realisation that happiness is a state of mind that you can control. That just doesn't occur to some people until it's too late. So I just ran through 20 common regrets people have when they die. Don't let them be your regrets. What can you do differently today and tomorrow and the next day to enjoy your life more? No one likes to talk about death, but it's a fact of life. The problem is that not talking about it, many people never get around to preparing for it either, which brings us to the question, when do you need a will? What do you need to prepare? And that question was actually asked by Joanne from Marysville in Victoria, who left a message on our website asking, I'm in my 40s. When do I need to make a will, and what are the right steps to take? So to answer that question, I've got with me today Ken Race, Director of Metropole Wealth Advisory. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Michael.
Now, it seems like there's two certainties in life, but they talk about it all the time, death and taxes. And while I know we generally prepare for our tax responsibilities, your team helps our clients do that. We do that pretty efficiently. Most people don't seem to be set up for their estate planning or their wills, Ken.
That's absolutely right. And from speaking to a lot of clients that come to see me, I think it's because they actually can't decide on what they want to do. So without being rude, please, it's like sticking your head in the sand. The problem doesn't go away, you just ignore it. And I think making a will for many of us makes us feel vulnerable when we consider our mortality. None of us like to think of death, and many of us think if we don't do a will, that means that we might have pushed it away.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things they put off, a bit like putting off insurance. But unfortunately, I've had a couple of people around me the last year or so who had some very sudden and terminal illnesses. So I think it is important. And it gets even more complicated today when so many people have blended families.
That's right. I mean, studies have shown that at least 45% of Australians do not have a will. And what that means is the government will decide on who will get your money under predetermined formulas. And each state of Australia has a different set of formulas they would use. So that might mean that the wrong people in your family group will get a payout, a smaller payout or a bigger payout, because the government will decide. So we really don't want to have that part of our wealth dictated to by the government.
Gets a bit more complicated when sometimes assets aren't in your own name, in trusts or companies or in your super fund as well. So let's start with the basics, Ken. Who can prepare a will?
I think you've got to go to an estate lawyer, a specialist estate lawyer. And while that might seem a little bit of an overkill for many, I think it's important to set up the right type of will, because there's three questions you need to ask yourself when determining how you'll want your assets distributed on death. And those three questions are who, like who will get your estate, what, and that is what will they get. And that is a relatively simple will which is dictated by your wishes. A very critical component, though, is the third question, and that is how it will be distributed. And that how will make significant impact on the taxes that could be paid, on the protection of those assets from one generation to another, and in the unfortunate circumstance of a family breakdown of your children or relatives in the future, you could find that your assets will then go to the wrong people, can I say the second time around. So you need a lawyer to actually be able to cover all those bases and help you properly decide the how.
So clearly those online will kits and the $30 ones you get at the newsagent aren't right. So I guess another question you really got to ask is who's going to manage your affairs when you're dead, because sometimes your children are not of the age that you want them to get the estate, and for others there are, as we've said, blended families where it's going to come in different proportions or at different times. How do you decide that?
Yeah. Look, you mentioned a very important word, your estate. And your estate are effectively those assets that are in your personal name. So your will manage those. So those things include, the homes, the investments, the cars, the shares, where you are an owner, either individually or with somebody else as a joint tenant or a tenant in common. So typically the family home is in joint names. So when one partner dies, the surviving partner automatically picks up the ownership. But if you're on there as tenants in common, then that is your asset, that part of it. So your will actually dictate where that goes. But most of us have what we call non-estate assets. They are assets that are not in your name, the principal one being superannuation. So you need other documentation to manage that. On your death, the person who's going to, if you like, follow your wishes and distribute in accordance to your wishes is who is known as the executor. So the executor will then carry out your wishes. So it's very important to, can I say, have a couple of options in your will, just in case the person you've chosen either doesn't want the job or is no longer there.
Okay, so one of the people you've got to is appointed is the executor, and you pointed out that you're probably going to need other documents, and I think that could be subject to another quick podcast about what you need for estate planning, because if things aren't in your own name, such as trusts and super, that's not part of your will. But can anyone inherit my wealth? Can I give it to anyone I like, Ken?
You certainly can. The restriction, though, is predominantly on superannuation, because there's basically only 4 categories of people who can inherit your super, and that is spouses with a very broad definition, children, people who are financially dependent, and interdependent people. And within that group, there are different taxes that will apply. Another critical one that a lot of people forget is if they pass down shares, if you pass down shares to somebody who is not an Australian resident at the time, then there are significant taxes on shares. So normally there's no taxes when you distribute your wealth, but there can be in relation to shares and superannuation. So again, a good estate lawyer, a good tax lawyer, a good tax accountant will help you go through that myriad of the issues in relation to taxation.
Okay, if I do pass assets on, is there any tax involved? Is there any capital gains tax or death taxes?
Look, in Australia, no, but as previously mentioned, there could be taxes on part of your superannuation, and it can be as high as 30% plus Medicare. So you want to be very careful on how you distribute your super. If it's a family home that you're pushing on, then there are some particular rules that will eliminate any taxes if that is subsequently sold within a 2-year period. But any other assets go tax-free. When you sell them, you have to pay tax based on the original purchase price of the person that was bequeathing them to you. So there's completely different tax treatments for assets that were bought pre-capital gains tax legislation and post-capital gains legislation. So again, identify the assets and talk to a good tax accountant who can actually then help you distribute those assets in the most tax-effective way.
Oh, so clearly then one of the big benefits of having a will is it provides certainty on your death. It gives certainty about your wishes, how you want your assets passed on, how you want them divided. And this, I guess, also gives family peace of mind, because it's amazing how often people seem to argue, families fight about that, and at a particularly sad time in one's life anyway. So it makes sense to see the right sort of advisor in advance, Ken. And if the listeners want to actually find out a bit more about it, I know they can chat with you and your team at Metropole Wealth Advisory about estate planning at metropole.com.au. Now, Ken, I think this has actually opened a whole can of worms. So could we come back next week and have a chat about estate planning, a little bit more about that, a bit about the documents, because it sounds like there's a lot more than the will involved.
Much more than a will. And sadly, different ways of drawing up that will can actually generate significant tax penalties, as high as 66% for money going to young children. So you don't want to inadvertently prepare a will that generates those high taxes when it could have been easily avoided.
And again, the reason you need to get good advice, just like I guess you've got to cover yourself with insurance as well, and hope you never are around to see the need for both of those. Thanks for your time, Ken.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, there was plenty of great information in that chat with Ken, a lot more than just when and if you need a will. And next week, we're going to have Ken back to talk about 5 documents you require for estate planning. And even if you know where at that point at the end of your life that you need estate planning, you actually have to plan long before you require it. So I think there's going to be some good information in that show as well. Now, I'd like to read out a review I received on iTunes. And remember, anyone who leaves a review and I read it out, I'm going to gift you one of my books. So email me at michael@metropole.com.au and I'll gift you a book. And this was written by a son who said, an absolute must listen to for anyone considering investing or further investing in real estate. The value of the information that's shared for free across this channel is unmatched. Having developed properties myself, this podcast clearly sums up the soul of what property development's about from start to finish. The investment strategies that are shared in this podcast channel are realistic, easily executed, and rewarding for anyone who's prepared to learn and implement the sound advice. Thank you, Michael and the team, for your great work. Well, thank you for that lovely review, son, and there's lots more to come in future weeks. But I really appreciate the reviews. It makes me feel great. It actually spreads the word too, and that's really, really important. And if you could spread it by leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to this, and I'd also like you to tell somebody about it. Share it on Twitter, Facebook. Our job, once we become successful, is to pass the message on to other people. So pass the message forward. When you do that, you'll be helping somebody else. Just like I feel good when that happens, I hope you will as well. I look forward to having a chat with you again next week.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth through strategic property advice. If you got value from today's show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a review and we'll read it out on a future show, and Michael will gift you one of his books as a way of saying thank you. Just go to michaelyardneypodcast.com/review and let us know what you think. If you don't already subscribe, head over to iTunes or your favourite Android app. You'll find us there as Michael Yardney Podcast. If you'd like to gain instant access to the show notes, head across to michaelyardneypodcast.com. Watch out for our show next week. You'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes.